Good evening and welcome to everyone from Kinloss and the United Synagogue, on Zoom and watching us on social media. This evening I'm in conversation with Shaun Bailey AM, who is the Conservative Party candidate for London Mayor in the May the 6th election. I should like to clarify from the outset that we're not yet in the 6-week short campaign, which is governed by very specific electoral rules. Nonetheless, invitations for similar conversations were sent to Mayor Sadiq Khan of the Labour Party, Louisa Porritt of the Liberal Democrats, and Shaun Berry from the Greens. Shaun Berry got back to me and has deputed Zach Polanski, who is candidate for London West Central, to represent her, and I'll be in conversation with Zach next Thursday evening. And Zach is here on this Zoom, I see. I'm keen to know more about the leadership voices in our community and those seeking responsibility for our city, its environment and infrastructure. I'm interested in those who express positions for or from diverse traditions and whose religious values underpin their platform. Shaun Bailey is proud to identify as a grandchild of Jamaican immigrants and a reborn Anglican. He grew up in social housing in Ladbroke Grove. His journey to the political fore is not one of privilege. He describes his likely trajectory and the experience of so many contemporaries in bleak terms. Many turned to crime. He says, he writes, "I am one of the lucky ones. That I escaped my destiny, I put down to 3 things: being part of a close-knit family, having a determined mother, and being enrolled with the Army Cadet Force, the ACF, when I was 12 years old." Shaun Bailey has experienced unemployment and what he describes as bad jobs before setting up a charity to help underprivileged youth. Shaun has spent 20 years as a youth worker, and he says helping young people get out of crime and into work. He was an advisor in Downing Street, helping to deliver the National Citizen Service, the largest youth program in British history. He contested the 2010 and 2017 elections for the Conservative Party, standing for Hammersmith and then Lewisham West and Penge. And for the last 5 years, he's been a member of the London Assembly, in his words, helping to hold the mayor to account. Over the years and in his recent campaign, he's been no stranger to controversy. Shaun Bailey, good evening and welcome.
Good evening, thank you.
Can you share with us some insight into your childhood? What was it that set you on a different path to your contemporaries?
Wow, first and foremost, thank you for giving me this opportunity to address your members of Kinloss. I really appreciate that, thank you. In answer to your question, I would say my determined mother is no small part of that. And by that, I mean all of the women of my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation. We came from very poor circumstances, but those women in particular held us together physically, emotionally, spiritually. I can tell you stories of every Sunday without fail being at Auntie Ryan's house having Sunday dinner, because of course it saved my mum the expense of cooking for 2 growing boys on a Sunday. My childhood was a very happy one. We were, to coin the phrase of my brother who's unfortunately passed away, dirt poor. But it was a long time before that became important, because we were very rich in happiness. You know, my mum is and was a practicing Christian and would regularly pray for us and make us feel good about the universe. So it was good. It's only as we got older and you started to realize you had less and less than the people around you, it became an issue. And then once you'd sort of crossed the age of 9, 10, 11, 12, friends started very quickly falling off to gang membership, to just crime in general, and being crushed by the situation many of us found ourselves in. But for me, I wouldn't change a thing in my past. I loved my community and my mum dearly. We had a Polish neighbor who's a wonderful man, the Irish kids across the road who made life just super fun, always building bikes and the like. Yes, I'm a consummate Londoner, born and bred, tough circumstances, and a mum who just led us out of that situation.
Thanks. Just an invitation for anybody who's got specific questions about the mayoralty campaign. We'll definitely be getting onto that. Please do put them in the chat, and I'll get to them later. Just a little bit more on Shaun's background. What about your background makes you qualified to lead, do you think?
I think being qualified to lead is about stepping up to a situation. I've had a lot of experience in leadership, anything from starting my own charity to running somebody else's charity, to being special advisor to a number of senior government ministers, not least of all the Prime Minister. But I think my version of leadership doesn't rely on me being some kind of Superman. I think as a politician, and I reluctantly accept that label, you are a generalist looking for specialists. So what I will be doing is putting a very strong team to lead London. It isn't all on me. I'm very specialist in the things that interest me, the moving forward of poor people, the creating a space for people to thrive and lead their own lives. But things like business and environment, I definitely will take good advice. I think one of the things that makes me different to politicians, and like I say, I'm not really a politician. I regularly get in trouble for speaking in the way that ordinary people speak rather than politicians, is that I will take good advice. I don't care where the good idea comes from. I'm much more focused on impact. I want to see people live independent, healthy, fun lives. And to do that, you want a life that's as little dependent on the government and more connected to the family and the community around you.
Right. Your wife's a teacher?
Yes, she is. She's currently teaching GCSE history.
Wow. And what have the two of you learned? She must have been teaching throughout the last year. We're hitting what's going to be a succession of anniversaries of COVID. What have the two of you learned about the last year in terms of what the country needs and what our youth need?
I think the big thing we've learned together is just how tough homeschooling is. For my eldest daughter, who's just turning 14, she, in certain aspects, absolutely sailed through it. She likes to work at her own pace. Being at home really aided that. But the other piece we learned, our son who's 11 hated it. He needed the formality of school, the structure of school, the building. He doesn't associate being at home with working in an academic sense. I think also the big takeaway was just the sheer impact on young people's mental health. If you'd asked any of us beforehand, we'd have told you, of course, they need their friends. Of course, they need to run about. School is very good for them. I'm not sure as a nation we understood just how important school is, the notion of getting out and being amongst your peers. I'm not sure we all knew just how important that actually is.
You talk about family and strength of family and being around a table with family as a very important part of your upbringing. You talk about religion also. I think you were raised as a Methodist, but later became an Anglican. What was it that helped you re-find religion in your life? What does religion offer you in life?
So I was christened as a Methodist. My grandmother was a Methodist. Our local church was. My grandma's very active in there, and my mother. I then at teenage years went my own way. The Western world is very, very, very seductive, very seductive. So off I went. I came back to my religion as an adult because of a need to develop, mostly spiritually. I think I was very young and naive spiritually, and I wanted the time to sit and pray and consider and read the book and see what that meant on my life. I had been doing youth work for some time at that point, and one day in the park just felt the need to help some more. And in order to help more, I felt like I needed more knowledge, more grounding. I think for me, we live in a world where people often talk about being mindful and yoga and all these things. But of course, for Christians and anybody of religion, really, prayer is the equivalent of that. And I found it made me calmer. It made me reconsider some of my beliefs, social beliefs, and certainly spiritual beliefs. And it gave me a wonderful community. And by this time now, several wonderful communities who are able to take me to task in certain things and support me in others. And I also gained a wife out of it, which is lovely.
And you found religion, or it found you? Was there some charismatic or spiritual leader who inspired you?
No, I think I found it. If the truth be told, I had a lot of problems with the church, and I went and did a course called Life. And the vicar said to me, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship with the Lord. It's a very personal one for you, and it will work out the way you want it to work out. And that really, really helped me to delve deeper. I think at the time I had survived some very tough times. I'd been homeless shortly before that. I'd been unemployed before that. I dealt with some of the roughest situations and young people that I'd ever come across, and I just needed support. You know, I come from a tradition where you're a tough man and you grin and bear it, but we all know that we need support. And I think for me, my new religious convictions and foundation gave me the support I needed to go on and grow.
You're speaking at the moment to a Jewish audience. Do you have a specific message to us?
It's funny, if I had a specific message to the Jewish audience about faith, it was something that an imam said to me. An imam said to me, I used to run a very big youth project, and there's a lot of Moroccan boys who are Muslims. And one day a new imam came to preach to them, and they had told him about me, and he had sought me out. And he said, I understand that you're Christian. And I said, yes. And he said, thank you for looking after all these Muslim children. I said, okay, I appreciate that. And he said, look, we are all people of the book, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. And he said, we should work to get along. He said, we haven't always got along, but he said to me, it's not the religion that makes us fight, it's the politics, which was interesting because many years later I went into politics and I wondered what that would do to my faith. But him saying the words, we are all children of the book, is something that I'm still exploring now. I need to find some meaning in those words for me. I believe there is meaning. I haven't quite figured it out for myself.
So in that vein, in No Man's Land, which is a thought piece you wrote in 2005, a while ago, you wrote, you don't know what to do. You bring your children to school and they learn far more about Diwali than Christmas. I speak to the people who are from Brent and they've been having Muslim and Hindi days off. What it does is rob Britain of its community. Without our community, we slip into a crime-riddled cesspool. There are really a lot of good things, there are a lot of really good things about Britain as a place and British people as a body. But by removing the religion that British people generally take to, by removing the ethics that generally go with it, we've allowed people to come to Britain and bring their culture, their country, and any problems that they might have with them. And it's 15 years ago you wrote that. Do you still stand by those remarks?
No, but what I would say is this: they were written in a time when multiculturalism was being used to remove some of our own identity, to deny new communities access to what it is to be British. And if you look at the success, particularly actually of the Jewish community, it's been one of integration. So the Jewish community has been very good at holding on to its own traditions, its own beliefs, but also being very integrated as well. I was in an environment then where we had the worst social outcomes for our communities and nobody was allowing us to integrate. So for many people, it felt great that they were able to say, isn't this multiculturalism nice? Sort of the Blairite times, but nobody was saying, how do we make sure that these children stand a chance in Britain? How do we teach them the soft skills, the very, very important skills that will make them successful as a community and as individuals here? And it's a function of our current time that people like to take things from times gone by and run them through the prisms we have now. And that's why people keep giving it to me. But
Yeah.
I'd say this to people: the same people who criticize, where were they when my community, and by that I mean poor immigrant community, needed the help? It was me who spent many, many years wading through the misunderstandings, the victories, the losses for myself, for my Muslim community. It was complicated.
The people who celebrate Diwali now, they're every bit as British and every much as part of our culture and heritage in London now?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you look at the success of the Indian community, it's a demonstration of that. But remember, this was a conversation with people who were not from the Indian community, who were talking about a community and doing things that were holding parts of our community out from advancing. One of the best things about being British is being both. So for instance, I'm of Jamaican descent. I quite proudly carry my British goings on and my Jamaican goings on. At the time, we weren't being told, we weren't being allowed to do that. That was written in response to very local goings on. I happen to be an honorary colonel for the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, probably my greatest honor and one of the most British things a person can do. These two things sit naturally and well for me. At the time, we weren't being allowed to develop in that way. People were trying to park us and ghettoize us. And I wanted our children to make sure they were integrated, because I believe the journey of their grandparents was to be able to access all of the benefits of this country, not just some of them.
But is that integrated on Anglo-Christian terms?
No, it's integration on any terms. People weren't being allowed. If someone had said to them, you remember at the time, I was not a Christian, so I wasn't selling faith to anyone. I've never done that, and I certainly wasn't doing it then. But at the time, people weren't allowing them to look at the structure of the country, the beliefs, the rules of the country, and that holds you out. That not understanding how British people convene and move forward means that you can never be part of it.
Right. So what's your vision for London? What should we be proud about? How do we celebrate our individualities and identities?
I think now, as a nation, probably as a Western world, we're far better at celebrating our individualities. Sometimes maybe too far. I think what we need in London is a bit of togetherness. I think we need to be pointed in a similar direction. I tend to spend very little of my time being critical of Sadiq Khan, but I think some of his activities have been quite divisive. If you look at,
you called him a mad mullah.
I never called him anything such thing. I retweeted a tweet about a failed bus contract, and that happened to be in a string of tweets. That's what happened. It's not my nature to call people mad mullah. I'm not even sure what a mullah is, quite frankly, so I didn't call anybody that. But the point I'm trying to make
Islamic religious leader that it has the capacity to be incredibly offensive.
Well, if I had said that, that would be an issue for me. But of course, I didn't say that. So it's not an issue for me, is it? The point I'm trying to make, we do things, he has done things now, such as a statue commission, which I think drives a wedge between communities. The best thing about London is the London identity is very, very strong. People hold on to it very well. And I think we should use that as a convening point to bring people together. So my vision for London circulates around 4 things. One is to make London safe. That's the first thing. That's job number 1. Record levels of crime. I mean, robbery's gone up 80%, knife crime's gone up 60% in the last 4 years. This is not good for any community. So we want to make London safe. That means 8,000 extra police officers on the street. So we have the man and the woman power to follow up on crime and pursue criminals. But of course, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. That's why you hear me talking about an army of youth workers, some 4,000 youth workers I'll put to work in London to support our young people to be able to relax, learn the soft skills they need to learn to progress, have a safe space to go and just keep a bottle on the parts of crime that are driven through poor youth culture. We can do some work around that. The other piece would be to help those young people who are in and out of jail very regularly. I think we have an adult education budget, £330 million, just shave a piece of that off and make sure it's focused on work preparedness, getting those people the skills they need to get into the job market. I think that'd be really powerful. Some of the more struggling communities in London lack employment. And I think jobs are much more than just the money. Employment's a very big and important thing. So we do that. I think if we want to clean the air of London, we need to avoid the mistake of taxing people to pay to pollute doesn't stop people polluting. I think that's the mistake of extending the congestion charge, ultra low emission zone. I won't do any of those things. What I will do is make the entire bus fleet 0 emissions. That's the equivalent of taking 1.1 million cars off the road. What I would do is give the black tag cab industry interest-free loans to help them adopt the new cab faster so that they can lower their emissions as well. What I will do is look at the emissions that come from building sites. I think through building regs and some lobbying of the government, we can force them to use biodiesels and not the polluting diesels they use now. Also, we need to open up the green belt. There's a lot of green belt land around London that isn't accessible. I think we can do some work to make that accessible as well. And the other piece I put down is housing. I want to build 100,000 homes for £100,000 using a shared ownership model. I think if we want our children to have a stake in London, we have to give them the opportunity to own. If you ask 87% of Londoners want to own their own home, I want to help them fulfill that dream. I think it's an important way of making people believe that they're a Londoner, own their little corner of London, and give more to their community because they feel part of that community.
Right, and people are going to be able to afford the down payments and the repayments?
Yes, because if you do the shared ownership model, you can buy anything from 10% to 99% of that property. So if you take the basic model we're looking at, the average down payment in London is £109,000. Using my shared ownership model, it'd be £5,000. And then a person would always pay less if they owned a shared ownership property than if they rented the same property for pure rent. My goal here is to make many more homeowners, not many more landlords.
Who are your political influences? How did you end up as a Tory?
I'm going to say my grandmother. She was a real believer in trying for yourself. My mother is a real, get out the house, get a job, get some work. Please don't be dependent. My mother used to say, when you're dependent, you're not the master of your own destiny. She really did influence me. At no point did she tell me I should be a conservative, but her beliefs are all that of conservatism, and they definitely came into me. I'm a big fan of one nation conservatism. I think a social conservatism that says, do your best and we will do the rest, is a very, very, very important and worthy goal for a nation. I think a nation can strive and survive on that. So I like one nation tourism. And of course, I'm not a socialist, in that I think in the context of the Western world, socialism is a dependence, and it makes communities weak, and it gives very strange people power over huge groups of people. It robs them of their agency, and I believe in the agency of people.
You talk about making partnerships with business, and businesses are beholden to their shareholders. You're talking about that with the transport system, for example. Don't you see there's a risk in handing over power to people who are already incredibly powerful and whose job is to make money out of the people who will pay for it?
No, because my plan means all assets remain in the public arena to give away what is our crown jewel in London. Let's be clear, TfL, Transport for London, the actual network rather, is one of the major constituents as to why London is the greatest city in the world. If you set up a business anywhere in London, everybody from basically the whole southeast of the country can come and work for that business. It's a very important feather in our cap that we have. So I wouldn't give away that control. What I'm suggesting is we use the capital markets, the huge amount of expertise we have in such arena, to develop public amenity. It's amazing that we have so much money flowing through London and we don't use some of that to the benefit of Londoners. That to me strikes me as crazy.
What are we going to do for the high streets and the small shops?
So I have a high street fund planned. I think what we need to do on the high streets is do two things: drive footfall. London is in the bottom 5% of footfall and spend for high streets in the country, which is just an incredible stat. So what I want to do is help change the experience of the high street. We need high streets that people visit and spend some time in. So I'll be giving money to different high streets across London to redevelop, to change the use of shops that may have closed down because of COVID, to pedestrianize where necessary, all those kind of things, and to change the use of some of those shops as well for new and interesting uses. Because I think changing the experience of the high street is the only way it can survive against the internet and against the economic shock that has been COVID.
Right. What do you see as the importance of the mayoralty and City Hall?
I think there's two ways you could potentially look at that. One is purely administrative. A strategic body for London is very important. I'll give you an example of this. We were talking about Crossrail since the 1960s. It never happened. The minute we had a strategic body, we were able to bring it into effect. And that's how London, how the City Hall spans across London. London is lots of separate boroughs, for instance, but it is still one city. And I think we need to look at ourselves in a strategic sense. For instance, our housing need is more than any one borough can deal with. Having a strategic approach to that gives us a chance of solving it. The other way of looking at City Hall, of course, is that it then stands as a beacon as to what Londoners want. It stands as a place of convening. So for instance, I want to run lots of trade missions. City Hall gives you the weight, the right, the real estate to bring people in and say, this is London's wares, connect with these wares, buy these wares, grow business here, we'll grow business wherever you're from. It's a very strong convening power. And also it's the ability to keep London safe. It's the ability to keep London safe, to provide homes. All of those things rest in City Hall and can be accelerated with the right leadership.
Was Boris a good mayor?
Boris was an exceptional mayor. It was a time when London was on the up. It was a time when London was safer than it is now. Boris was able to deliver the Olympics. He was able to deliver a cut in crime. He was able to deliver housing. And if someone said to you, what would you like as your legacy as mayor? Surely delivering housing and a safe London, either one of them would do. The fact that you manage both of them is probably a really good thing.
Right. Let me just, number one, apologize to people who was trapped in the waiting room for about 10 minutes there. I really apologize for that. Number two, if people have got questions, please do send those in on the chat. You just talked about a feeling of safety on the streets, and just in a tweet that you put out today, or yesterday, you said, as a father and a husband, it breaks me to think that my wife and daughter have to live in fear in their own city. It doesn't have to be this way. As mayor, I'll ensure that we're working to deliver for the safety of women and girls in London. That was seen as politicizing a very tragic murder in London. You know, if you Google Shaun Bailey in news today, which is clearly not a scientific way of looking up anything, but if you Google it, it gives you Minister stands by Shaun Bailey and Prime Minister refuses to stand by Shaun Bailey, with Allegra Stratton saying, you have to go to Shaun's team and have this conversation with him. Well, I couldn't, you know, I'm well placed at the moment. I'm having a conversation with you. Is the Prime Minister confident in you? Has he said he's happy with the way you are conducting your campaign?
I mean, the best way to say that is this: he's very happy with my plans to defeat crime in London. He told people to come and speak to me because he trusts that I'll be able to defend my position and who I am. But most importantly of all, one of the cheapest and most readily played tricks in politics is to put out the idea that, you know, somebody who's senior to you is not happy with you. Every time that's been done, the first person to row to my rescue has been one Boris Johnson. So very early on, they tried to say they had taken some money from me, and Boris pointed out we didn't give him any in the first place. He's on his own, as is all Tory candidates. I have complete confidence in him. And he then ended up doing 2 fundraisers for me just to demonstrate that he's on my side. Boris and I speak regularly and mostly about crime in London, because as I pointed out, his legacy was to leave a safer London, and he's quite shocked at the very dangerous London we have now. So is the Prime Minister happy with me? I mean, as far as I know, he's ecstatic that I'm the candidate. I am the only candidate who's ever been selected where the Prime Minister has immediately called and told the party, this is our guy, get behind him. So I can only say his actions would suggest that he is a great fan of mine, which of course I'm very humbly thankful for.
And are your wife and daughter do they feel unsafe on the streets of London?
Today, Sadiq Khan came on the radio and said London is not safe for women and girls. I want you to think that through for a second. You have the Mayor of London who's happy to tell all the women in the city that the city is not safe for them on his watch. So how I express myself, look, I am a father and a husband. It's how I view the world. You know, if I trip over, I'll think, oh my gosh, you know, Aurora's father has tripped over. If someone charges me more, I think, well, that's money away from my family. I'm just expressing from my point of view. But what reinforces the fact that I'm correct is that the mayor himself has openly admitted that the city under him is not safe for any woman or any girl. That is a humongous failure on his part. And I can't believe that isn't what people are speaking about, rather than the fact I express myself that I'm worried that my wife and daughter can't walk places, remembering it was the police who issued a statement saying there's parts of London that women shouldn't go. I don't think that's acceptable.
So well, I might say that he's identifying a problem that we have. I don't know that it's necessarily expressing complacency in it. You've advocated stop and search.
He is the mayor of London The top line of being Mayor of London says you are the police commissioner for London. You are responsible for public safety. So if all of the women and all of the girls in London are not safe, it squarely falls at his feet, remembering the last mayor was able to make them safe. So he has failed to make them safe. He's not identifying a problem, he's identifying his failure.
And you advocate stop and search by more policemen on the beat?
The reason I advocate stop and search is for two reasons. One, let's just take 1 month. In February, 17 people stabbed, culminating in the death of Sven. I forget Sven's surname now, but Sven, a 22-year-old boy. He went out to buy orange juice and bagels and never came home. In January, in the midst of a national lockdown, we had 352 firearms offences in London. So we are under pressure. We are under the pressure of a crime epidemic. I already told you, robbery has gone up by 80% in the last 4 years, knife crime by 60%. So I do think something very serious needs to be done about the criminal activity in London. Crime is so bad in London now, we are now exporting it. We provide 60% of the county lines activity across the country. Somebody has to take responsibility for it. Somebody has to stop it.
How do we change the circumstances that drive people into crime? You say your contemporaries, so it's way before Sadiq Khan, your contemporaries grew up in an environment where they grew up into crime.
But why did my contemporaries do that? Because crime was easy to do. There's three big steps you can take to stop people going into crime. Firstly, make being a criminal hard to do and risky for the criminal. Second is giving people a decent way out in life so they can just live the life they want to live, get married, not get married, have a job, whatever it is. And all of that is predicated on someone taking responsibility for the first two. Neither of those things happen in London, so here we are. Remember, Sadiq Khan stood on a platform and told everybody it will take 10 years to cut knife crime. What he said in that statement is, what that statement translates to is, I'm not going to take responsibility for it. If you're a criminal, that's carte blanche. You say, okay, that's carte blanche. If you're the young people I still work with and mentor now, that's fair. You then think to yourself, well, if he isn't going to take care of knife crime, I will by carrying my knife. That's the thing. The idea that poor people are running around committing crime is not true. Most poor people, their only relationship with crime is the fact that they're a victim of it. We need someone to make sure that criminal behavior is not acceptable. And if you look at the stabbings in London, they don't involve money. They involve other things. It's a violent environment, and we need to push that down. So when I say stop and search, it's because it saves lives. People who are armed have to believe that weapon is going to be found, because if they don't, they'll continue to carry the weapon.
But it doesn't encourage some kind of racial profiling?
You don't need racial profiling. You need to stop all of the people who you think may carry knives. And the point I'll put to you is this, twofold. Firstly, a solution. I've advocated for scan and search from the very beginning, which is a non-invasive infrared technology which can just scan hundreds of people at once, and the police would only talk to you if you had a knife, and clearly at that point you're a criminal. But the other point, which is still related, if you are a black person, you are 4 times more likely to be murdered in London. 4 times. For me, you can see how for me there might be some advantage in leveling that out. 4 times more likely to get murdered. That's just not acceptable, because what that's done to the black community is deliver a level of trauma hitherto unseen. I grew up in a very rough neighborhood, does not match what the children of London are trying to deal with today.
Have you experienced systemic or institutionalized racism?
Yeah. If institutionalized racism exists, and I think we can agree it does, then of course I've experienced it, because I've been here my whole life. I was born in Paddington, and I now work in London Bridge. I've been around it. And is it a horrible thing? Yes. Is it something we need to get over? Yes. But I think we get over it, not by embarrassing people, not by shaming people, but pointing out where we can make the improvements. I think if you shame people too hard, they turn away and harbor that resentment and find other ways of inflicting it on you. I really do think a good open public conversation about this, an ongoing conversation, and real deliverable means to change this is the way to move forward.
So reading what you've written and listening to some of your interviews, you label Black youth, young girls, baby mothers, hip hop, and have drawn considerable ire from your own community. I was a little bit taken aback that people of color were complaining to me that I was even hosting you as a mayoral candidate in the community, and they were offended and took umbrage at positions you've taken, as if you were holding the community to account for a system that holds them back. Should they be changing, or what should we be changing?
Firstly, I simply do not accept any of what you've said. For instance, just before I came here to speak to you, I've just been speaking to the community in the context of the Jamaican High Commission, which, to all, as far as I can see, because of the message I received, everybody likes the fact that I was there, what I've been saying continually. It is, imagine I was Jewish for a second and I had an opinion on what's going on in the Jewish community. There'd be some in the community who hated it, there'd be some who loved it, but none of them would deny me having that opinion. I'd argue that's the same thing going on in my community as well. And all the things that you've said, I've said, are simply not true or have been taken out of context. So what I have said is I've always and will always face down the biggest issues facing my community. And I've brought them out and I've spoken about them, and I'll continue to speak about them, because if you don't confront a problem, it grows. It grows. So let's talk about hip hop for a minute. We have a music that suggests that Black people should kill other Black people. I can't see how I'm wrong to challenge that. I simply cannot see how I'm wrong. And if I am wrong to challenge that, I'll continue to be wrong. You know, if I was to sing to you some of the lyrics of the songs that are routinely played by Black and white children about Black children, you would be shocked. So that's why I came out about it. My whole life has been, it's been about representing people. It's been about taking the step. It's been about asking the questions that people won't ask. And do you know why I'm happy to do that? Because I've watched my community thrive. Has it been tough? Of course it has. It's been tough for me. It's been tough for people around me. But I've watched my community move forward and thrive. And for every person who doesn't like what I say, there's 150 people who do, because it's the challenges of our time, and those challenges must be faced.
And you're going to face them for us.
Well, some of it is for you, some's for me, some is for my children, some's for us collectively. The best thing about a democracy is it is messy, it is loud, but we all have the right and the opportunity to add to the debate. And I just do my little bit from my corner.
Right, just again, an invitation for people to put some questions for Shaun in the chat here. I've got greetings, Shaun, from my son Joe from Myrna. In there. Public transport, really important. You spoke about it as the heart of the jewel of London. What are you going to do differently?
I think there's a number of things. Firstly, we need to control the cost in City Hall, rather TfL, to lower some of the costs. There's a few efficiencies that could be there. I think we need to get a good relationship with the government so we can get a good deal. One of the things that Sadiq Khan has really failed on is the relationship with government. He's not trusted by the government audit officials, which is important. It wouldn't be a massive surprise if he didn't get on with the other party, but it's officials who are not trusting him as well. And what's interesting is when Boris was mayor, he got on quite well with the Labour government. He made things happen. Sadiq Khan doesn't seem to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is twofold. I will run a sponsorship program to raise the money that TfL needs to make sure that over 60s travel and under 18s travel can be maintained as free. We have done a very small version of this in the Olympics. I will simply expand it to make sure we cover that cost and then some. They do it in Dubai. They also do it in New York. So I know there's a commercial appetite for it. But the big thing to do is to start a London infrastructure bank. We have mayoral SIL 2, which is an income that the mayor gets, and business rates receipts, which is another one. If you lump them together, I think we could take probably 368 odd million out of there and leverage that money in the markets to 10 billion. And the reason I want to do that is so that we have the money to spend on maintaining the the transport network and invest in the network. Anything from fixing potholes to repairing Hammersmith Bridge to expanding the DLR or improving disabled access. The model I'm using is the model that the KfW Bank used to rebuild Germany after the Second World War. It's a tried and tested model. It's such a good model that the Chancellor has recently said that he'll do a national infrastructure bank to do a similar thing for the whole country.
I used to walk over Hammersmith Bridge to and from school every single day, and devastated that it's out of action at the moment.
Yes.
Very important. We glossed over something that's really important, because you devoted 20 years to youth work. And you say that you'll help out young people get out of crime with 32 new youth centres and 4,000 new youth workers. I mean, can you just share some of your experiences as a youth worker and how you can see that being part of recalibrating society and structuring people to better lives?
I think people always dwell on the fact that I got a lot of young people away from crime, and I did, and I'm intensely proud of that. But the larger group of young people is that I just set them on a positive path. And in most cases, I was gently guiding a young person who was going to do well. The vast majority of young people turn out to be fabulous individuals. That is a fact. And I think it's the job of adults, both through society, through family, to nurture and guide. I set up my charity to do that. The nature and the time and the place where I set up my charity meant that I did an awful lot with some of the tougher cases, because I was a street worker. I used to walk up and down the street. Let me give it to you like this. How I originally started, I was a drug worker, and I used to go into the job centre and take the job cards and walk around the streets, bump into young people, say, come on, I'll fill the card in for you. You can get a job. Let's do this. I've got an address if you need to use your address, because I use the office address, and we get going. And I built up from there, and then eventually made a great big charity that had a girls group, a boys group, a football club, a job club, all manner of things. But my thing about youth work is, if we can inspire young people to look in the right direction, they fly. They do amazing things. If we can challenge young people with some of their own responsibility and say to them, you're good if you try, but you need to put in some work, it makes a big difference. My time in youth work taught me one very important thing. You have to take things on. You have to grasp the nettle. I worked with young people who were drug users. I would have realistic and often very tough conversations with them about the effect it was having on them and how tough it would be to move forward. But I'd always reassure them that I'll be there as best I can to support them. And I'd also try to involve the family. For me, if you can get a young person's family behind them, you will do 50 times better in half the time. So for me, the whole youth work thing is to help young people build a resilience to some of the more attractive but damaging things that happen in London.
On the chat here, I've got, what are you going to do about the congestion charge?
The congestion charge, I'm on record of saying I will wind it back to its original operating times and costs. I think at this time now, it's absolutely killing business in London, and COVID has been very bad for London. Unemployment will be significantly worse. And I think we need to get London moving. If we want to lower pollution in London, we need to give people an alternative, not a charge. So what I want to do is have many more car clubs in London, make sure that we have low emission and zero emission cabs in London, so people don't feel the need to own a private vehicle. That should reduce the traffic. We need to do more nighttime deliveries as well, because we have this great big system that we only use 10 hours of the day. I know nighttime deliveries will work because we did it in the period of the Olympics. So I think we need to extend that so we can lower traffic in the day.
And council tax?
Council tax needs to be wound up. The current mayor wound back, excuse me. The current mayor has raised council tax by 31% across his tenure. At the same time, he's increased his own office costs by 80%. There's no need for either of those two things. There's many a saving he could have made in City Hall to keep a council tax cut, to keep a council tax rise down, to have no rise at all. We demonstrated it to him as a Conservative group on the GLA with our budget amendment, which of course he rejected. But the point is, the council tax rise is because Sadiq Khan has been very profligate with the monies of London.
A lot of people received an official-looking envelope with a crest purporting to come from City Hall and the Latin motto talking about the mayor's council tax plans. But it wasn't official, and it seems to be associated with your campaign. Was that a fair tactic?
Yes, and let's be clear, it's been done before by the Labour Party. And I was quite surprised when they put out the fake piece of news that they were bringing me to the CPS, because of course, the first thing I would have said to the CPS if they were interested, well, I was only copying what the Labour Party did. But the more important thing is, it had to be brought to people's mind that at one point, Sadiq Khan was proposing raising his part of the council tax by 21%. And the only reason that didn't happen is because of the campaign I mounted and then the colossal pushback of Londoners, because they, like me, could not see any justification for a 21% rise in council tax when the mayor had given executive staff at TfL, for instance, a £58 million bonus package. He had done that. Why had he done that and then decided to pass the bill directly on to Londoners? It simply isn't right. And I did that campaign. Londoners made their voices heard, and the rise, although big, was smaller than it could have been.
Have you made any mistakes along the way?
Of course, I'm only human. If there's anybody here who hasn't made a mistake, please let me know your magic source of knowledge, because I'd like to tap into it. And if you want to hear mistakes, speak to my wife. She's probably got a long list of mistakes I've made.
TfL has hugely reduced fare income. How is the service going to be maintained? That comes from Robert.
Income from the government. Look, to be clear, Sadiq Khan constantly says that TfL is the only network in the world that didn't have a big government grant. But that's because it was raising the money through fares. That makes sense. Now that we've had a shock to the fare system, the government have made it quite clear. I had long representations with Grant Shapps. He's made it quite clear, we will cover the cost of COVID, we just won't cover the cost of Khan. Remember, TfL was bankrupt long before COVID. At one point, it was £1 billion out of pocket. And Khan only got a little way to solving that by sacking 30% of the staff, the very 30% of staff we needed to deliver Crossrail. Crossrail was then late, and it ended up costing everybody £3.6 billion. So when I went to the government, they made it quite clear, we are more than prepared to give TfL a grant, and they've done that twice now, and we'll do a third one. They've made that quite clear. I would ask, though, and please don't mistake my comments for the government being perfect, because they're not. Because I would ask that they gave a better indication of the long-term funding settlement so that TfL can plan. That's still a big chink in their response. But let's be clear, they've covered the cost of COVID, but they will not cover the cost of Khan, and neither should they.
So you raised a very important question about the balance of power between City Hall and Westminster. Do you think it's right at the moment?
Yes, let's be clear. We have a GLA Act, and Westminster have never transgressed that GLA Act, as far as I can see. I mean, there's an argument that they could have stepped in earlier around Crossrail, but they didn't. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of Transport for London, and they let Transport for London administer it. It went wrong, and it cost the public £3.6 billion.
Question from Nicole. What would you do to tackle anti-Semitism at universities in London?
I think the big thing to do is to take the fight on, let it know that it's not acceptable. I remember more than 2 years ago now, a group of Jewish students wrote to me and asked to see me and speak about it. And I straight away went and met them, and they gave me chapter and verse and told me some really quite bizarre stories of the challenges they were facing. And that's why you've always heard me step out against cancel culture, because for me, that's where it came from. I think it's ignorance. I think it's racism. I think institutions that support it should be brought to book, and people should look at their government funding if they're getting it. I certainly would help champion that. We need to provide Jewish students with as much freedom to speak their mind as any other students. I welcome the government's progress on this with their charter and bringing universities into disrepute and saying enough's enough now. You cannot have this happen anymore. And there's other things as well in the wider firmament that we can do. So, for instance, I'm a massive proponent of banning the Al-Quds March. I know we've had lots of sweet words from Sadiq Khan, but he could ban it. Why hasn't he? And there's a very big difference between sweet words and action. And I would take action. And the whole boycott Israel week, for me, is abhorrent. And I don't know why we allow that to happen. And on my watch, no way. No way. I think the things sit together. Jewish students have a hard time because we allow these other things to happen as well. Let's take all of these things on. Let City Hall use its power in any arena it has to stand up and confront these things. And again, first step, ban Al-Quds.
I Really appreciate you saying that. Question come in. Can you tell us about your view of the ultra low emission zone for Outer London?
I think the ultra low emission zone for Outer London is completely the wrong thing to do. I launched a petition against it. I think 60 or maybe even 70,000 people have signed it now. I think two things. One, it won't deliver. No, it isn't the only way to deliver air quality improvements. I don't believe that. I think removing the buses and lowering traffic is a far more effective way. And of course, it will cut communities in half. I used to live in Neasden, right up against the North Circular. But where we would shop is on the other side of the North Circular. If someone's going to charge me for that, that's me ruined. I don't want to keep doing that. What about the fact that my sisters, etc., used to go to school in Kingsbury, so they'd have to cross the North Circular. There's parts of Woodford, etc., there where it cuts people off from the local doctors and a hospital. I think it's mean-spirited. I think it's misguided. I think it will make the North Circular hugely polluted. And if we want to lower that pollution, we should be providing more electric charge units around London. We should be speeding up the delivery of modern cabs, and we should be zero emission in the bus. That's the best things to do, because ultimately you will be bringing people into a zone, and many places around there will be paying a charge and don't have an air quality problem. I think it's unfair, it's immoral, and it's ineffective.
So the commute has possibly changed a lot around COVID, with people working from home for a year. And clearly I got caught in a traffic jam the other day, so traffic is picking up again. But do you think that we're going to have to restructure the services that we offer, and possibly even reduce some of the trains and buses in order to save some money?
No, I wouldn't do that. One of the strong conversations I've been having with branch up the government, we must, for as long as possible, run as full a system as possible. London only works when London is open. That means people must be able to travel in and out speedily, easily, in the way they remember. That will not happen if we reduce services. We need people to return to London for the ecosystem of business to get going. If you sell coffee, if you're a lawyer, if you're a barber, if you're a retailer, you need footfall in London. And that means we have to get the workforce back into London. So all those services got to keep up and running. And as much as we do need road traffic for some of our economic activity, we don't want it to become excessive. And that means keeping the system running as smoothly and as at full capacity as possible.
Is there a way of, just talking about people driving around, something that's increased massively over the last year is the number of people who have taken up jobs with delivery services, whether it's for food or for major retailers, and a lot of people are trapped in a gig economy with no way of sort of progressing. Is that something that local government deals with, or is that all part of central government regulation?
I think local government can learn the lessons, can pass the learning up the line, but ultimately you'll need a national approach to that, because you can't fix a gig economy in one part of London or one part of the country and not somewhere else. I think the Uber ruling starts the momentum. The Uber ruling that says that these people are employees does start the momentum, and I think you'll see many more conversations around that. But I would say this, there are sectors where the gig economy, you'd only need to tweak it rather than completely bust it or stop it, because it's how that sector build up. I think of care work, where the work actually is quite regular and people like the flexibility to dip in and out. As long as we can protect the working rights of those people, and it's a choice that they've made rather than one that's been forced on them, I think you may find some sectors will go for a modification of their economy rather than an eradication.
Do you think we can do something, just talking about care workers, people in hospitals who are having to pay for parking, and they're working unsociable hours, and it's very difficult, and we're adding expenditure to them. Do you think we should be subsidizing them in their work?
There's two things. That's firstly why I won't bring in Sadiq Khan's Outer London tax. Over half of the police officers who work in London live outside of London, so would have to pay that. A large amount of nurses and firemen as well. And they're just three things. You could be talking plumbers, electricians, and of course, they'll just pass the cost on to us. So living in London will become more expensive again. So that's the first thing why I wouldn't do that. The second thing is, when it comes to parking on NHS sites, that is something the mayor can't legislate for. The NHS own the site and would administer the site whichever way they like. But I would say, when we're asking people to work shift work, which I've done for large parts of my life, you do need to make it as convenient as possible for them to get in and out, as why the job is unsustainable.
Right, because these are people working in the middle of the night, and the public transport isn't nice, and it's not safe to be on the streets. So, all right, we're coming to the end of an hour, and it's a very busy time for you. Is there anything particularly you'd like to say that we haven't had the chance to ask you about?
I would just say to remember, for me, the Jewish community has been a great learning piece for me. A few years ago, 2012, I went to Israel and my eyes were just opened. It was Palestine, Israel. It was just nothing like I thought it was going to be, you know, because my only experience was seeing it on the BBC News, and to be there was incredibly mind blowing. And I had a very for instance, if you looked at the BBC, you would think that Palestine was a refugee camp. I had no idea. It's a bustling, thriving city with people doing all the things they do in the city. I was so bowled over at how sophisticated Israeli business was. I went as part of a CFI delegation, and we went to see some very high-tech firms. I mean, my degrees in engineering, these things I'm very interested in. Cutting edge doesn't get close to explaining the stuff that I saw. And I had a lunchtime meeting with an Orthodox rabbi, and I had one of the deepest conversations I've ever had in my life. And in that very British way, everybody was sort of saying, "Shaun, stop! You can't ask those questions. You can't say those things." And the rabbi was so bowled over with my directness and what I wanted to talk about. He invited us all for dinner so we could continue the conversation. And he just, again, what I really love is when you meet someone who expands your thinking, your mind, and gives you experiences that you couldn't have. You know, you get them secondhand, but they're still valuable. And he was running a school that was bringing over Jewish Russian girls and educating them. And I tell you what, the things he told me, the things he was able to show me, forever changed the person I am. And I'll always cherish that experience. And the other experience was just seeing where all the rockets land. I remember going into one of the shelters, and the guy who was showing us around said we were about 50 feet away from the shelter, and he said, "Shaun, there's a rocket." And I sort of panicked and ran. There was no rocket, but he was trying to get over to me the suddenness, the shock of it, and the fact that Israeli children grow up with that. And again, that is an experience. I couldn't read about that. If I'd read about it, it wouldn't have half the impact of him sort of, you know, jangling my nerves and showing me what it might be like if I actually had to face that every day.
So you understand why it is that we as a community take our security very seriously?
Absolutely. Intellectually, I understood it beforehand, but that was an emotional understanding. Yeah, definitely. Again, I went to Poland on a March of the Living, and the sheer scale of what I saw, I mean, there's not words. And the stories we were told by the survivor who led our delegation. I remember coming back and explaining it to my mum and having to tell her the same thing 3 or 4 times to try and give her the same sort of feeling and gravitas that the survivor had given to me. It was, obviously I couldn't do it, but I was desperate to give over that feeling because it touched me so deeply. And when I went to Yad Vashem and I saw the personal effects, it got across to me the sudden nature and the brutal nature of what went on. And I would say to anyone who hasn't been, they need to see it as firsthand as they can.
Thank you very much, Shaun Bailey. We've reached an hour, and I know you have places to be. Next week, I'll be talking to Zach Polanski from the Greens, and he's here on this. He's been here on this interview, so it'll be interesting to hear his feedback on it. Also, like to acknowledge Mike Freer MP, who has been here, and thank him for his support of the community over several years, and his consultation with the synagogue on many different issues and asking for our opinions. So thank you very much for that, Mike. Shaun, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to thank Sedef as well for all her help in setting it up. And I look forward to seeing you in Shul, which is open. But you do need to book in for the services, and I look forward to seeing you online, where we have a lot of activity over the week ahead. And Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, please check out, we have a game show which has been professionally organized and should be an awful lot of fun. Details in Kol Kinlos and online. Thank you all. Good evening.
Jeremy,
stay safe.
Jeremy, thank you for having me, and I just want to say hello to Zach. It's nice to meet a fellow competitor.
Thanks very much. Good evening all.